Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about an inspector calls. So we're going to go through Act 2 now. Let's start by listening to the audio towards the end of Act 1, and then we'll go through the written version. So just a reminder that the audio version is a little bit different to the written version, but just use that as an opportunity to challenge yourselves. Really listen carefully to the audio and see if you can find the right place in the written version.
Fool, he knows. And I hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet. You'll see.
Well, Mr. Croft?
What did I tell you?
Inspector, I think Miss Burling ought to be excused any more of this questioning. She's had an exciting day. We were celebrating our engagement, you know. Now she's obviously had about as much as she can stand.
He means I'm getting hysterical.
Well, I've no more questions to ask.
But you haven't finished asking questions, have you?
No.
Then I'm staying.
Why? It's bound to be unpleasant and disturbing.
And you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?
If possible, yes.
Well, we know one young woman who wasn't, don't we?
I suppose I asked for that.
Be careful you don't ask for any more, Gerald.
I only meant to say why stay when you'll hate it.
It can't be any worse for me than it has been. And it might be better.
I see.
What?
You've been put through it, and now you want to see somebody else put through it.
So that's what you think I'm like. I'm glad I realised it in time.
No, I didn't mean...
Yes, you did. And if you'd really loved me, you couldn't have said that. You listened to that story about me. I got that girl sacked from Millwards, and now you've made up your mind I must obviously be a selfish, vindictive creature.
I neither said that nor even suggested it.
Then why say I want to see somebody else put through it? It's not what I meant at all.
All right, then. I'm sorry.
Yes, but you don't believe me. And this is just the wrong time not to believe me.
I can tell you why Miss Burling wants to stay. A girl died tonight. A pretty, lively sort of girl who never did any harm. But she died in misery and agony, hating life.
I know, and I can't stop thinking about it.
Miss Burling has been made to understand what she did to this girl. She feels responsible. If she leaves now and doesn't hear any more, then she'll feel she's entirely to blame. She'll be alone with her responsibility. The rest of tonight, all tomorrow, all the next night.
Yes, that's it. And I know I'm to blame, and I'm desperately sorry. But I can't believe, I won't believe it's simply my fault that in the end she committed suicide. That would be too horrible.
You see, we have to share something. If there's nothing else, we have to share our guilt.
Good evening, Inspector.
Good evening.
Okay, so let's stop there and go back to the beginning. So Act 2, at rise, scene and situation are exactly as they were at end of Act 1. The inspector remains at the door for a few moments looking at Sheila and Gerald. Then he comes forward, leaving door open behind him. So notice these are not proper sentences, but that's okay, that's allowed, because these are stage directions. They're not intended to be proper, fully structured sentences, okay? And I've got pictures of Gerald Croft and Sybil Burling here, because those are the two people that the inspector interviews in Act 2. But just a reminder that at the end, Priestley has swapped over the last two characters, okay? So in real life, in the story, Eva Smith met Eric Burling before Sybil Burling, okay? But when the inspector interviews, he interviews Sybil Burling and then Eric Burling at the end for dramatic tension, because we're going to find out that Eric Burling made Eva Smith pregnant. Okay, so let's move to the first page. And this page here, you can skim through. You might, if you want to pause the video and just read through this, you can, but nothing that we really need to analyze. The only word you might want to look at is this word here. So hysterical means when you become extremely emotional. If we wouldn't use that word nowadays because it would be considered a bit sexist. But in those days, people did use this word for women. In fact, here you can see that it's Sheila herself using that word about herself. So a little bit of context there, language context. Okay, let's look at the next page. So here, this page as well, we can kind of skip through except kind of this bit here. Notice that Gerald thinks that young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things, but he's thinking of young women like Sheila, middle class, upper class women, but working class women, lower class women. He doesn't believe in that, and he certainly didn't treat Eva Smith in that manner. Okay, so let's move on to the next page. And this as well, we can sort of skim through just to say, so vindictive is somebody who likes to get revenge. And the only other thing we need to say about this page is we are seeing more of the relationship between Gerald and Sheila, that maybe they don't know each other as well as they think they do. We don't know exactly how long they've been together. I mean, we know they've been together for at least 18 months, 2 years, because they were together when Gerald had his affair with Eva Smith 18 months ago or a year ago. Yeah, sorry, last summer, so about a year ago. So yeah, they've been together for at least 6 to 12 months, but we don't know exactly how long. Okay, let's move on to the next page. Okay, so this page is really important. So what kind of language is being used here? What kind of words are these? Emotive language, misery, agony, and actually that word has been used before. So that's a kind of repetition there. There's two kinds of repetition. One where it's kind of together, so the same word repeated on the same line, or where it's repeated over the text. Okay, so the first sort, technically, that comes under the heading of language, but if it's repeated over the text, then it's to do with structure. Okay, and this speech here is really important. That word responsible again, alone, motive language, and how her feelings of guilt and responsibility are never ending. And notice how she is definitely feeling sorry and regretful, unlike the other characters. I mean, Eric does feel sorry later on as well, but Sheila is probably the one who changes the most and feels the most guilty. So, yeah, all these emotive words being used on this page here. And actually, this is interesting, isn't it? Because he's saying we. I mean, the inspector hasn't done anything wrong, certainly not as far as Eva Smith is concerned. But notice how he still uses the we, that we have to share our guilt. So, this idea of collective responsibility, of being responsible for each other, not just every man for himself, like Mr. Burling believes in. Okay, so this is where we left off. So, let's now go back to the audio version.
Evening, madam.
I'm Mrs. Burling. My husband has just explained why you're here, and while we'll be glad to tell you anything you want to know, I don't think we can help you much.
No, Mother.
Whatever's the matter, Sheila?
You're beginning all wrong. And I'm afraid you'll say something or do something that you'll be sorry for afterwards.
I don't know what you're talking about.
We all started like that. So confident, so pleased with ourselves until he began asking us questions.
You seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector.
We often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable.
Go to bed, dear. You'll feel better in the morning.
Nothing could be worse for me, Mother. I'm staying here until I know why that girl killed herself.
Nothing but morbid curiosity.
It isn't.
Please don't contradict me like that. In any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class...
Mother, don't! For your own sake as well as ours, you mustn't build up...
Really, Sheila?
You mustn't build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, the inspector will just break it down. And it'll be all the worse when he does.
She's right.
I beg your pardon.
I said she's right.
I consider that a trifle impertinent, Inspector. Now, what is it, Sheila?
I don't know. Perhaps it's just because impertinent is such a silly word.
In any case...
Mother, do stop before it's too late.
If you mean that the inspector will take offence...
No, I never take offence.
I'm glad to hear it. Though it seems to me that we have more reason for taking offence. I realise, Inspector, that you have to conduct some sort of inquiry, but I must say that so far you seem to be conducting it in a rather peculiar and offensive manner. You know, of course, that my husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago, and that he's still a magistrate.
Mrs. Burling, the inspector knows all that, and I don't think it's a very good idea to remind him.
It's crazy. Stop it, please, Mother.
Yes. Now, what about Mr. Burling?
He's coming back in a moment. He's just talking to my son, Eric, who seems to be in an excitable, silly mood.
Really?
I'm afraid he may have had rather too much to drink tonight. We were having a little celebration here.
Isn't he used to drinking?
He's only a boy.
No, he's a young man. And some young men drink far too much.
And Eric's one of them.
Sheila!
I don't want to get poor Eric into trouble, but this isn't the time to pretend that he's not used to drink. He's been drinking too much for the last 2 years.
It isn't true. Gerald, say it isn't true.
Well, Mr. Croft?
Actually, I've never seen much of him outside this house. But, well, I have gathered that he does drink pretty hard.
And this is the time you choose to tell me?
Yes, of course it is. That's what I meant when I talked about building up a wall that's sure to be knocked flat. It makes it all the harder to bear.
But it's you and not the inspector who's doing it.
But don't you see? He hasn't started on you yet.
If necessary, I shall be glad to answer any questions the inspector wishes to ask me. Though naturally I don't know anything about this girl.
We'll see, Mrs. Burling.
I've been trying to persuade Eric to...
Okay, let's stop there and let's just go back to where we were. So this is where we were. Okay, so this page we can kind of skip over. Okay, so this page is fairly important. I mean, you can kind of read through these lines yourself and obviously really pay attention to the audio version because that's where we get the real emotion and how the characters are speaking. But this is important. So another theme of the play is the difference between the generations, and basically Priestley was suggesting that the younger generation are more capable of change. We have to really rely on the younger generation to change the world. I mean, that's always been true, and it's true now. But that is a theme of the play that you can talk about in your essays. So he's saying they're more impressionable. I mean, that can be a good or a bad thing, actually. So young people, on the one hand, can be naive and a bit too innocent sometimes, and impressionable in a bad way. So, for example, with peer pressure and so on. But on the good side, they can be convinced to do good things. So, for example, climate change nowadays is the younger people who are leading the battle against that. For example, Greta Thunberg, obviously. I mean, obviously, climate change has got nothing to do with this play, but that their equivalent at this time would have been about workers' rights, class structure, that kind of thing. Okay, so this page, sorry about this gap, by the way, that shouldn't really be there. That's my mistake, doesn't mean anything. It should just be one line. But anyway, So most of this you can skim through, but this is really important. How she talks down about Eva Smith, girls of that class, obviously class structure, a main theme of the play back at that time. Class was really important. I mean, class structure is still with us today, but it's not as as obvious, or at least people won't accept it as obviously as they did back then. Okay, so let's go to the next page. And this is fairly straightforward, this page. This word here, impertinent, means to be rude. And I suppose the only point to note here is, again, linking to class structure, how Mrs. Burling speaks to the inspector. And she can only do that because she's upper class. Somebody who was lower class wouldn't dare, or I think would be a bit more hesitant about using that word to a police inspector. Okay, so we can carry on to the next page. And here, most of this is fairly straightforward. But if we go down to here, so again, notice how she speaks to the inspector and using these words, offensive and so on, which a lower class person would not probably use. And then all this name dropping and how important they are, Lord Mayor and magistrate and so on. So a magistrate is sort of like a judge, but not really. They're not proper judges. They're not qualified in the law and so on, but they are just selected people from the community. They're given extra training, special training, and they can judge minor offenses. Okay. So that's just a bit of side knowledge there. Okay, let's move on to the next page. And imperturbable just means somebody who is not emotional. They don't change very easily. And then the other thing to notice here is how this idea of Eric's drinking, that he is a drinker, too much heavy drinker, a bit of an alcoholic almost, but also more importantly, that Mrs. Burling seems not to be aware of this at all. So on the one hand, at the beginning, we get this initial impression of this close family having a dinner party, celebrating an engagement. But as we go on, we realize that the parents don't really know much about the children at all. Okay, moving on to the next page. So this page is just reinforcing that Eric's been drinking heavily for 2 years. Staggered means to kind of move backwards without meaning to. And this comes as a complete surprise to her. Okay. Okay, so this is where we left off. So let's listen to a bit more of the audio now.
To go to bed, but he says you told him to stay up.
That's right, Mr. Burling.
Why?
Because I shall want to talk to him.
I can't see why. But if you must, then I suggest you do it now. Have him in and get it over, then let the lad go.
I'm sorry, but I can't do that yet.
Now look here, Inspector.
He must wait his turn.
Inspector, I've told you before, I don't like your tone, nor the way you're handling this inquiry. And I don't propose to give you much more rope.
You needn't give me any rope.
No, he's giving us rope so that we'll hang ourselves.
Sybil, what is the matter with that child?
Overexcited. Well, come along, Inspector. What is it you want to know?
At the end of January last year, Eva Smith had to leave Millwards because Miss Burling compelled them to discharge her. And then she stopped being Eva Smith and looking for a job and became Daisy Renton with other ideas. Mr. Croft, when did you get to know her?
What?
Gerald?
Where did you get the idea that I did know her?
It's no use, Gerald.
You gave yourself away as soon as I mentioned the name Daisy Renton.
Of course he did.
All right. I met her first sometime in March last year, in the Stalls Bar of the Palace. I mean the Palace Music Hall here in Brumley.
Well, we didn't think you meant Buckingham Palace.
Sheila, you've said your piece. You're obviously going to hate this, so why on earth don't you just leave us to it?
Nothing would induce me. I want to understand exactly what happens when a man says he's so busy at the works that he hardly has time to come and see the girl he's supposed to be in love with.
In the Stalls Bar at the Palace Variety Theatre.
I happened to look in one night, and as the show wasn't very bright, I went to the bar. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town.
Women of the town? I think it would be much better if Sheila didn't listen to this story.
You're forgetting I'm supposed to be engaged to the hero of it. Go on, Gerald. You went into the bar, a favourite haunt of the women of the town.
I'm glad I amuse you.
Come along, Mr. Croft. What happened?
I didn't propose to stay long. But then I noticed this girl. My God. Sorry, I've suddenly realised, just taken it properly, that she's dead.
Go on, Mr. Croft.
She looked young and fresh and altogether out of place there. And obviously she wasn't enjoying herself. Old Joe Meggerty, half-drunk and goggled-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass.
There's no need to be disgusting. And surely you don't mean Alderman Meggerty?
Of course I do. He's a notorious womanizer, as well as being one of the worst sots in Brumley.
Well, really? Alderman Meggerty. I must say, we are learning something tonight.
Well, go on, please, Mr. Croft.
The girl saw me looking at her and gave me a glance. It was nothing less than a cry for help. So I went across and told Meggerty that the manager had a message for him or something like that. Got him out of the way. And then told the girl she'd better let me take her out of there.
Where did you go?
To the county hotel.
Okay, let's pause there and go back to where we were. So Mr. Burling comes in and we can skip to the next page. So this page you can just read through yourselves, and obviously you've heard the audio version. So notice the audio version here was quite different. They cut bits out and kind of changed a few things around, but essentially it's the same. And the main thing to notice here is the relationship between the characters, how they talk to each other, how the writer Priestley has created the drama and the tension. And on the one hand, the Burlings do talk down, Mr. and Mrs. Burling do talk down on the inspector, but at the same time, notice he does stand up for himself and he does show authority when he needs to. And the main thing here is when he turns to Gerald Croft, and obviously that comes as a great surprise and shock to everybody that Gerald knew her as Daisy Renton. Okay, let's move on to the next page. And this, you can just read through this. So he's now explaining where and when they met. Don't need to worry too much about that, except for the interaction between Sheila and Gerald. Induce means to persuade or convince someone to do something. And she's reminding him of what he said, that he was busy at work when actually he was with Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. And then this is quite important. So, a favorite haunt of women of the town. So, this is Priestley's subtle way of referring to the women who would be at the bar to kind of sell themselves. So, notice Priestley doesn't spell it out. So, these kind of phrases are called euphemisms. Euphemism. EUPHEMISM. So it's kind of like an indirect way of saying something. So here, obviously, instead of using the word prostitute, something like that, or nowadays we would use the term sex worker. So that's kind of that. And then this is interesting how hypocritical Gerald is. On the one hand, he goes to these places, he knows the kind of women that hang out there. Then he pretends, oh, I wasn't going to stay very long. I hate those kind of women, hard-eyed, dough-faced. So why go there then if you're going to describe them in those terms and you don't really like them? But then he says, "Oh, I noticed this girl who looked a bit different. She was pretty, and obviously this is Daisy Renton." And then suddenly he realizes that she's dead, this girl that he knew and he was with for a while. Okay, so then we go to the next page and we can kind of skip this bit here. And obscene means disgusting. Carcass means the dead body of an animal. And then this main thing here is to notice how these so-called respectable people are quite the opposite. Notorious means well known in a bad way, so famous in a bad way. Who goes after womanizer, going after women. Sot means somebody who drinks. Rogue is like a bad person. And an alderman is a senior city person just below mayor, so really very senior. So these respectable people, so called, are in these unrespectable places. And notice that he's not just there and kind of trying it on, he's literally becoming physical, and one girl escapes with a torn blouse, so he's physically assaulted her. And then here, Gerald presents himself as a knight in shining armor, how he goes in and rescues her. But of course, we know he's going to then abuse her himself. Okay, so this is where we got to, and that's a good point to stop. So I'm just going to skip to the last slide. As always, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe and tell all your friends. And I will see you in the next video where we'll carry on with Act 2.